On debate.
Thank you, Your Honour. Honourable colleagues, I'd like to thank Senator Gold for introducing this motion and Senator Lankin for taking on the role of consulting with senators about these changes and in advocating for them. As Rohinton Mistry would say, it has been such a long journey. If he were writing a sequel about the first 2 hours of tonight's debate, he might well have called it such a tedious one too. From the Senate Special Committee on Modernization to the work of Senators Mastercott and Green, to motions in this chamber from Senator Tannis and myself, to the reports of the Senate Standing Committee on Rules, Procedures and the Rights of Parliament, it has been a long journey indeed. In my opinion, the compass for that long journey has been and continues to be the Supreme Court reference on the Senate of Canada in 2014, which was requested by then Prime Minister Stephen Harper. In it, the justices reaffirmed that the Senate should not be a carbon copy of the House of Commons, but that it should be, quote, a thoroughly independent body which could canvass dispassionately the measures of the House of Commons, unquote. The justices went on to say, quote, the framers sought to endow the Senate with independence from the electoral process to which members of the House of Commons were subject in order to remove senators from a partisan political arena that required unremitting consideration of short-term political objectives. The Supreme Court reference is the critical context for Prime Minister Trudeau's decision to cut loose Liberal senators from his party in the House of Commons and to appoint members that are not tied to any political caucus. This is important to remember because the Senate circa 2015 had to do something fundamentally different if it was to try to restore some credibility and legitimacy with Canadians after the sordid years of the Senate expenses scandal. The Supreme Court had already explained why a Triple-E Senate, which was the question put to the justices by Mr. Harper, could not be realized solely by the actions of the federal parliament. That is why the move to a more independent, less partisan Senate in 2016 was, in my view, the most profound reform in the history of our institution. Make no mistake, this motion is about protecting that historic reform. In this respect, it is ironic that the folks who are against the motion come from a party that has most loudly championed reform of the Senate. Whatever the motivation of Mr. Trudeau in proposing this change, it should be seen as a lifeline for our institution to rebuild its credibility and legitimacy with the Canadian public. The polling speaks for itself. A NANOS survey commissioned by our colleague Senator Dasko a few years ago showed that 76% of Canadians agree with the new merit-based appointment process, and only 3%, let me say that again, 3% want to return to the previous model of partisan appointments. Indeed, 81% of the public describe the fact that, quote, new senators sit as independent members and are not active in a political party, unquote, as a good change for the Senate. Even so, colleagues, the same poll showed that nearly a quarter of respondents believe the Senate to be ineffective or pointless. This is not a statistic to be proud of. And while we may be comforted by the reality that the Senate is not about to be abolished anytime soon, you can be sure if that number creeps up, the calls for abolition will get louder. This is the larger context in which we are discussing today's rule changes. This motion says to Canadians that we are actively working on improving our institution by making it less partisan and more distinct from the House of Commons, as the framers of our Constitution intended. Colleagues who are against the motion, on the other hand, want to turn back the clock. We know that it is true of Conservative senators, but I can tell you there are revanchist Liberals and would-be Liberals who also pine for the good old days of a partisan duopoly, each tied to the fortunes and dictates of the corresponding political caucus in the House of Commons. They see the role of the senator as advancing the objectives of the party as defined by the Prime Minister or the leader of the party in the House, and they will happily toggle from government to opposition back and again, election after election, one day extolling the importance of opposing everything the government does, and the next day decrying attempts by the new opposition to counter everything they do. This is, of course, the hoary argument we heard last week from our Conservative colleagues about the sanctity of opposition and why only they deserve that appellation. It boils down to the assumption that senators affiliated to a political party are the only ones capable of criticizing government legislation. It is not only a daffy argument, but it is insulting to the rest of us who every day of every week are looking at bills we get from the House of Commons and are trying to do our duty as senators to scrutinize those bills and make them better. Every one of us, not just the handful of folks who have anointed themselves as more blessed than the others. If you think this is a bit harsh, look at report number 5 from the Standing Senate Committee on Rules, Procedures and the Rights of Parliament. It documents that Conservative senators believe their group is more equal, more worthy, and more deserving than other recognized parliamentary groups. On that basis, the Conservative members on the Rules Committee refused to accept rule changes that the overwhelming majority of members on that committee supported. The proposed rule changes discussed over many months in the Rules Committee are by and large the same ones in this motion. The Conservatives have been propagating the fiction that they are the official opposition in the Senate, even though there's no such term in our rules or in the Parliament of Canada Act. And yet we heard Conservative senators use the term in debate on this very motion. Indeed, the very senators who claim to be arch defenders of parliamentary practice and tradition. Now, there's a certain desperation in the deliberate distortion of our nomenclature, but it is made worse by the conceit that the way in which Conservatives carry out the work of opposing in the Senate is superior to how non-partisan senators do it. And what is that allegedly superior style of opposition? Let me quote Senator Platt, who is trying to speak over me right now. In response to my question to a speech he made on the Income Tax Act, he had this to say: I am making a speech that is contrary to what the government is doing, and I don't need to defend that. Well, Senator Platt is correct that he doesn't need to defend a speech that was full of internal contradictions and non sequiturs. It is certainly his right to be contrarian for the sake of being contrarian, but colleagues, that is not what is meant by sober second thought, and that surely is not the form of opposition we want to demonstrate for Canadians. Now, Conservative supporters will, of course, cheer on Senator Platt for being obdurate, and Liberal supporters will cheer on any would-be Liberal senators who behave similarly on the other side of the debate. But is this any way to run an upper house? If you think it is, you have just boosted the number of Canadians who think the Senate is pointless or ineffective. One of the favorite arguments used by Senate duopolists is that the test of being a true opposition member is in how you vote on government bills. By this measure, senators who vote for government legislation, even amended bills, cannot be part of the opposition. This is a daffy argument, and I must say even some independent senators are taken in by it. Think about this. When we have voice votes and the opposition cries, on division, do you think it means they oppose the bill? If it did, why don't they call for a standing vote each time? The reason is that on division allows them to have the deniability of not supporting a bill or not opposing it. They want to have cake and to eat it as well. In fact, we even have seen the spectacle of Conservative senators standing to vote for a government bill after having spoken vigorously against it because they suddenly realize the bill might be defeated by a plurality of independent senators. This was the famous vote on C-83 concerning structured intervention units in 2019. Look it up. The video is educational. Or consider the following thought experiment. Suppose the majority of independent senators consistently voted against government bills. This, by the way, should strike terror in the hearts of Conservative colleagues who are hoping for a change in government. But if that happened, they would surely cry foul play because, and here's the clincher, they allowed government bills to go through while they were in opposition. In any case, imagine if, in fact, a Senate filled with independent members consistently voted down government bills. What do you think that would do to our legitimacy? Would Canadians break out in joyful support for the Senate and cheer us on to keep doing the same? It's daffy, right? The Conservatives pretend to be the true opposition in the Senate, but their goal in doing so is to become the government after the next election. That is, of course, the prerogative of political partisans, but it is not reflective of today's Senate of Canada, which consists overwhelmingly of non-partisan members. Whereas Conservative senators are opposition members for only as long as their party is not in power, the rest of us will remain independent of the government, whichever party is in charge. How can we take seriously the claim that the real opposition in the Senate is the group that will ditch that title as soon as it has the opportunity to do so? Daffy. Let me take on another hoary argument that was trotted out again in last week's debate by Senator Martin and repeatedly tonight by Senator Platt and others. It is that things are working fine the way they are, that even without rule changes, the Senate can accommodate senators who don't belong to a partisan caucus, that the Conservatives have been willing to grant speaking time, committee seats, travel privileges to non-partisan senators, and that, goodness gracious, the leaders and facilitators of recognized parliamentary groups are even consulted on some important decisions concerning the Senate. This, colleagues, is the argument of arrogance and noblesse oblige. It is the let them eat cake argument. I will grant Conservatives this. If their idea of the upper chamber is that it should be aristocratic, as in the House of Lords, where there are different classes of members and that they belong to the privileged class, then they are indeed being true to an idée fixe of the Westminster model. But that is not the Westminster model I want for Canada. Non-partisan senators will not stand for eating cake or relying on the largesse of 13 senators for our rights and privileges. Because you can be sure about one thing. The Conservative opposition to this motion will not stop here. Their leader in the House is clear that he wants to return to a partisan Senate, and I'm sure there are Liberals who are also wistful for the bad old days of duopoly. There will be forces in both parties that will want to roll back the more independent Senate of today, to marginalize the role of parliamentary groups that are not affiliated to a political caucus, and to return to the cozy arrangements of alternating government and opposition, doing little more than mimicking their counterparts in the other place. From the outside, the rule changes proposed in this motion may seem trivial. And it is true that much of this motion simply codifies the current practice. But the implications of not passing this motion are very serious indeed. If we entrench the privileged position of a political caucus that styles itself as the opposition, any political caucus, we will allow for the erosion of the rights of other parliamentary groups and their members. And that could lead to the demise of the independent Senate experiment. As it is, this motion does not go far enough in advancing the goal of a less partisan, more independent Senate, so there's more work to be done following the passage of this motion. After all, the point of a more independent, less partisan Senate is not just about how we do our work and what makes us feel good. It is much more so about the credibility and legitimacy of an institution for generations to come. I am not so naive to think that a Senate made up entirely of independent members will in and of itself make Canadians love the upper house, but I am sure that a return to partisan duopoly will do the opposite. Let's pass this motion quickly and use it as the basis to further modernize and improve the Senate of Canada. Thank you.